Our outer self has three components. So this is talking about the outer self: rationality, the facts we know, and our physical senses. He almost like bypasses the body there, although physical senses are obviously arise from the body. Rationality is what connects our inner and outer selves, and the nature of that connection depends on the nature of our rationality. Our rational capacity, though, is worthless by itself if our feelings or desires do not flow into it, activate it, and bring it to life. It follows then that the quality of our rational capacity mirrors the quality of our feelings. There's a common theme in Swedenborg that intellect alone it can't accomplish anything. You need emotion and intellect together. Nothing in our outer self ever shows any life except emotion. Positive emotions come down from the heavenly plane, or in other words, from heavenly love, which bestows life on everything it touches. A loving goodness constantly flows in from the Lord, and it flows through the inner self into the outer. People under the sway of negative emotions or corrupt desires pervert that goodness, but the life that comes with it still remains. So our characters are getting a little more defined here. So you have the positive stuff, the good thoughts, the good feelings. They flow in through the inner self to the outer self. They can be flipped around. Everybody's receiving the same inflow of love from God. If we really don't want it, we can flip it around and turn it into nastiness. But that doesn't mean you don't get access to it anymore. Everyone always has this flow. So that's the outer self, is sort of the outer layer of the mind as well, and the physical senses, so how we interact with this world, but sort of the more superficial aspects of the personality. But the inner self is more than just like a nicer version of our mind. It's a more expansive, bigger thing. And Swedenborg describes it a bit here. This is read from his book, True Christianity, with, I forgot. We have this, this is just him further defining the outer self. The outer self is only a kind of tool or organ, in itself devoid of life, that receives life from the inner self. When it does, it appears as if it contains inherent life. And my job is so easy, because if I mess it up, someone will just, nope, you got to do this right here. It's like I'm being carried along, which is great, as it should be. And that's basically, it takes on a little more meaning, because we know the outer self is more than just the body. The idea that the body is the tool of the spirit or of the mind is pretty common. But if our outer self is also sort of our outer rationality and our outer emotions, that all of those should be the tool of this inner higher self. Takes on a little more significance there. Okay, we talked about the inner self. Let's meet it now a little more. This is Swedenborg's True Christianity 154 being read with some imagery to kind of illustrate what he's getting at. So here's a little intro to our inner self.
Our inner self acts on and in our outer self, but not through it. Our inner self contains thousands of things. Our outer self takes from our inner self only what is suited for some useful purpose. In our inner self, the part of our mind that enables us to have volition and perception, there are arrays of concepts in enormous quantities. If these concepts flowed out of our mouths, they would be like a blast of air from an industrial bellows. Our inner self, with its universe of contents, is comparable to an ocean, a large flower garden, or a park. The outer self takes from it just as much as it needs to get something done.
So, and actually, when we came across that passage, I was like, whoa, man, I hadn't really heard it described like that. There's an inner self that's part of us, but listen to the language he uses to describe it. He says it has a universe of contents, or it's like an ocean. He says flower garden too, but I think ocean is a little more awe-inspiring. Although gardens are pretty hip if you get right down to it. Okay, so there's this our outer self, which is sort of our outer consciousness. There's this huge inner self. I don't know if it would be similar to the subconscious that's described, but there's all these concepts in there, and actually they only little, tips of the iceberg show up in our outer self, and only as needed. We have this spiritual ocean, that the inner self is likened to that. And it's not just Swedenborg that describes this in this way, that we have this sort of inner, more, that we're a little more than we realize. And this is important, Because if we're trying to find out what's our true self, we got to know what's the whole self. What do we encompass? That we got to have all the pieces in line if we're going to figure out what kind of tool set we got, right? So here's Natalie Sudman, who had a near-death experience. She wrote a book called An Application of Impossible Things, a near-death experience in Iraq. And she wrote, "We are individual and unique beings on Earth who are even more uniquely and individually expansive than most of us are now aware. We are more than our physical bodies and the limitless minds and consciousness focus of this physical environment."